Hello. The subject of today's lecture is political communication at the interpersonal level. Now, there are pretty big problems with political communication when we talk to each other. Part of the problem is there's little decorum, right? We often treat each other pretty rudely when discussing political issues. Another part of the problem when discussing it amongst friends or family is that political beliefs are pretty deeply held. In fact, they're of the most deeply held beliefs that we have. I somewhat regularly see people change their mind about, say, popular things, the music that they like. I see people change their minds about the part of the country that they want to live in. I see people change their minds about whether or not God exists. But I very rarely see people actually change their minds about the political ideals that they hold. Now, this is related to, but it's actually another part of the problem, is that political ideas are ideological, which is to say that they're not often really justified by a certain set of facts or propped up by a particular thing in the world. They're more about the world and projected on the world. So it's really pretty hard to get a handle on in ideology. It's not to say that it's unchangeable, but it's not changeable through traditional methods. So there's little decorum, people are being rude, these beliefs are very deeply held, and they're ideological, which makes them slippery, shall we say. So these are some general problems with political issues. But political communication particularly is fraught with some difficulty. Part of the problem is that we try to persuade each other when it comes to political issues. But very rarely do we take the position of who is this person that I'm talking to, what do they believe, and how can I best argue in a way that will make them see what I see and agree with me. Usually political persuasion means yelling at the other person about the way that we believe ideas, and we usually frame them in ways that we feel passionate with little respect for how they feel passionate about the world. So our mode, which is persuasive, it's often not very strategic persuasion. It's ideological on our own side. We're trying to represent our beliefs as we understand them. And oftentimes when you try to persuade someone, you need to represent beliefs in a way that they understand them. So that's one part of the problem, is this persuasion is the prime method, but it's not good persuasion. It's kind of like cheap, makes me feel good because I said what I believed persuasion. Another part of the problem is that in discussions of political communication, it often becomes kind of a process of one-upmanship, which is to say that even though we might be disagreeing on a particular issue, the conversation doesn't always follow a logical track. In fact, it oftentimes is more predictable about making claims about why the other person is wrong, and then that person trying to one-up you in return. And so conversation doesn't always make sense. We sometimes leap from issue to issue, and if we feel ourselves losing on one particular front, sometimes we'll leap over to another idea and try to attack them there, because it's really more about winning or losing the argument, not actually making change. And then I would say finally, the third kind of communicative issue is that oftentimes people aren't listening. So while they are in conversation, as the other person's talking, they're formulating their response, not really actually soaking up what the other person has to say. So generally, I see the three problems being little decorum, deeply held beliefs, and ideological as the three general problems about political issues, but then political communication is troubled by this thin persuasion, one-upmanship, and a lack of listening. Now, with all of these problems, you might be tempted, and some people are, to just not even talk about it. Why talk about politics at all? You certainly get in less fights, you might not ruin relationships, it's really bad to fight with in-laws or the parents of the person that you're dating, so why even talk about it, Sometimes once political beliefs are out there, the nature of the relationship is permanently changed, so, why even talk about it? Well, there's actually a pretty good reason why. Part of it is because we live in a democracy. Our very civilization, our entire society is founded basically on the idea that we have to talk about politics. Because if we're not talking, someone is going to steal our political power away from us. So while there are many hurdles and many challenges to effective political communication, it doesn't mean that we can simply say, oh, well, it's difficult and therefore we shouldn't do it. Because it's difficult, but therefore critical. Because those conversations, as they move forward, as two people at an individual level come to understand and influence each other, they move each other in a little way forward, and a massive numbers of those conversations happening across an entire society, well, it has the promise of moving everybody forward. So, the purpose of today's lecture is to break down a couple of practical methods for effective interpersonal communication. Now, much of the rest of this class is going to focus on rhetorical and organizational theories concerning politics, but today I want to focus on some stuff that we can do in our everyday lives concerning politics and how we talk about it in order to improve what we do. So, I want you to harken back to your basic public speaking class. Now, whether or not you took public speaking here and maybe with a teacher that you taught it with, the 3 speeches that you gave might have been different, maybe you gave 4, but many of us learned to give 3 speeches, and they are informative speeches, persuasive speeches, and invitational speeches. And if you're not super familiar with those definitions, real quickly I'll go over them, but I kind of want to take that approach to breaking down different options that you have when discussing politics. So we have informative speaking. Informative speaking is about transferring information. When you gave an informative speech in class, you might have given a speech about how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, or the status of ice melting in the North Pole. But what you never included in an informative speech were any shoulds, oughts, or you had betters. You stuck strictly to the facts. And so one way of thinking about political communication is to get away from that idea that you have to change the mind of your listener. Instead, maybe your goal is to fill the mind of your listener. Fill the mind of your listener with some facts, some information. So, if you take an informative approach to political communication, your primary goal is to explain. The belief that you have, rooted in the reasons that you have it. Another way of thinking about this is that you try to represent your beliefs. What you're doing is you're kind of like, imagine all of your words are Legos, and with each little word you build up this kind of structure that is your belief. And in that process, you are representing your ideas. Now, a tip when taking the informative method is try not to be a know-it-all. One thing that people often do when discussing politics, and they are knowledgeable, is they'll just kind of try to overwhelm the other person as a way of one-upsmanship and persuasion. But really it's ultimately about performing our kind of hoity-toity, I'm a dick and I know everything. So try to avoid that when taking this approach. Now, I'm going to kind of lay out the other ones, and then we'll talk about which ones you want to use when. So then there's persuasive. And any persuasive messaging is one that is trying to change either the ideas or the actions, right? So the beliefs or the activities of the listener. You're trying to elicit a change. Whereas information, I mean, somebody who knows something is changed from when they didn't. But with persuasive, you have a goal, right, that you want to accomplish. So maybe you're talking to a liberal and you want to persuade them to become a conservative. Maybe you're talking to somebody who is pro-life and you want to persuade them to be pro-choice. Maybe you're talking to somebody who's for stricter or looser immigration policies and you want to switch them to the other side. That's persuasion. So, when you are persuading, I sort of alluded to this while talking about the problems, is consider your audience. This is so really very simple, but it still amazes me that so few people do this when engaged in political communication. Oftentimes, people use interpersonal political communication to justify their beliefs, not actually to make change. So oftentimes, even though you might think you're being persuasive, if what you're saying makes sense to you, it might not actually be the best thing to say. If they agreed with all of the things that you believed, they would probably agree with your conclusion. So one of the things that you've got to do when you're actually trying to persuade someone is try to find the kind of steps along the road, the components of the ideology that are different in the person who is listening to you than they are in yourself. So, a classic issue, right, with abortion has to do with whether or not an abortion is terminating a fetus or a human being. And there are kind of subcomponents of that too. If it's a human being, is it a human being who yet has its rights or not? Or more to the point, does it have a soul? I mean, certainly you don't want to chop up something that has a soul. Generally that's a bad call. Things with souls you want to treat real nicely. So you got to consider your audience. If you're trying to persuade someone one way or the other on the abortion issue, if they disagree with one of those kind of fundamental things, it doesn't mean that they're not persuadable, but it means that you're going to have to think differently about why you would justify your belief. So, I mean, to take that abortion issue into more detail, so if you're talking to somebody who thinks that, no, that being has inherent life immediately the moment that it's conceived, and you're trying to convince them that it should be illegal to have it be aborted, you're going to need to think about situations where two people their welfare comes into conflict, and you're going to need to make sense of them why the woman's interest or the society's interest can overcome that. And if you're not sensitive to that fetus having interests, if you're not sensitive to the idea that that fetus is valued, if you make claims like, oh, whatever, it's just a cluster of cells, they're not going to be persuaded because they're going to see you as some kind of horrible monster who thinks that you're a bad person and someone who thinks that, something that is real value doesn't, right? So consider your audience, figure out what their assumptions are, and try to work with those. Another thing to keep in mind is I generally use mixed justification. That's that word, justification. When arguing, I try to change up the foundations of my arguments. So if I find that I'm making a lot of pro-social, positive society, great push of humanity, and I'm not getting very far on that, sometimes I'll kind of switch over to a different mode of thinking, which is moral certainty and the enactment of value and doing the right thing in troubled times. These are different justifications for political beliefs. People justify political beliefs through science, through history, through religion, through personal experience, through belief in other political ideologists. Anyway, and oftentimes we kind of get stuck on one of them. So people will take, I've heard a lot of religious arguments for not having abortion be legal, right? And if you're going to try to persuade someone that abortion isn't legal and you're hammering on the, well, it has a soul argument and the person isn't budging, well, it might be time to change. They might not believe that the thing has a soul. So you've got to flip it around and say, okay, well, that first justification, it didn't work, so let me change it up. And you might want to make the argument that the best way to achieve the greatest society is one where those who have the smallest voices are still protected, right? You can drop or at least, cool down the religious argument and try to make, a complex social argument for why this is actually good for society at large and anyway, so try to change up your justifications. A tip on persuasion: pick a topic. So oftentimes when we get into these debates, we want to kind of change the person whole cloth. We see, wow, they disagree with us on these 6 different issues, and I'm going to go after all of them. But the chances are, in one particular conversation, or even in one particular relationship, that you could possibly change someone's entire ideology. Not only is it very small, would you really even want to succeed at changing someone's entire ideology? That would be kind of a scary amount of power. So I really suggest that you pick, kind of hone in on a particular issue and learn how to tap different political ideologies in order to justify that issue. So to use a personal example, I'm very interested in issues of homelessness, and I'm involved in an organization that helps homeless youth. And I gotta tell you, I can make a political argument for why someone should help our organization, and I can make that sound really liberal, I can make it sound conservative, I can make it sound libertarian, I can make it sound religious, I can make it sound atheistic. I can make that argument for homelessness sound a lot of different ways. And part of it is that I've just been faced with a lot of different people, and that I needed their time, or a particular skill, or some of their cash, or access to their organization, and I just had to sit there and think, oh crap, how can I make this make sense to this person? Pick a topic, because people very rarely, we don't like to change who we are, but if you can focus in enough on a particular issue, sometimes you can actually elicit change. My younger brother is pretty passionate about ending overseas wartime operations, right? This is like his major political issue. But whenever he talks about politics, he starts there, but then he starts branching out, and pretty soon he has alienated everyone who disagrees with him. And I actually got into a pretty big discussion with him about how he can more strategically focus in on that and think of the people who disagree with him and try not to change, all 8 of their beliefs, but just on that particular one. For him, he's pretty liberal, and so we've worked out ways to make a conservative argument for a withdrawal from overseas operations. Anyway, so this is pick a topic, right, when persuading. The third kind of mode or method of discourse is invitational speaking. And this is, instead of just filling someone with information or trying to change who they are, this involves trying to create a space of mutual understanding and respect. Now, that's hard. With politics, often, because, frankly, we don't want to understand each other, we want to change each other. But, as I've said before, these conversations have to happen. And so mutual understanding is a pretty critical and awesome part of what the democratic process is. So, fostering mutual understanding often takes, it often takes a couple of things. One, good invitational speaking happens in a place where basically people respect each other's self-determination, which is to say that for the duration of the conversation, we don't try to change each other's minds. We, in fact, explicitly say we're not trying to change each other's minds. We know that we are, the people who, I'm the right person to make my decisions. That's what self-determination means, that I am the one who makes my decisions. And so if you're going to use an invitational style, basically setting up that, okay, we're going to respect each other enough to have this mutual understanding, that's going to require self-determination. you also kind of have to sell the value of people understanding each other. So sometimes you have to kind of frame an invitational interaction by saying, you know what, I'm really curious as to why it is that you believe what it is that you believe, and I want you to tell me more about it. And as they tell you, you can frame it. Well, I'm not trying to change your mind, but it's interesting because I see it differently. And you can kind of tag your statements in ways that kind of disarm them and make them less dangerous to the person that you're sharing with. I love invitational speaking, and I love invitational conversations where people delve deeper and deeper into each other's ideologies. It is capable of happening. It's not terribly weird. Another tip for invitational speaking or invitational political communication is try to make it so that people have equal voice. Oftentimes when you're using persuasive modes of discourse, you actually kind of want to talk over the other person and have more kind of airtime. But with invitational speaking, it's very important that all people feel free to articulate what it is that they have to say. And it's amazing that when you give people a little more room and give them a little bit more breathing space, they actually say way more intelligent things because they kind of have time to come up with it. Whereas when you're like pressuring in and they're pressuring back, a lot of times people say ridiculous stuff that they don't mean. One of my favorite things about invitational discourse is that it often reveals the complexities of an issue and it helps you understand your position way more. Because if you give somebody time to articulate what it is that they'll say, they'll work back and they'll actually work through that whole network of ideology. And if you seem curious as to why, and if they secretly want to persuade you, they'll give you details, which can be really illuminating and helpful for your own personal growth. It may change your mind, or it may arm you for future persuasion against that person or people who believe like them. So I sort of see these as three options, and not one of them is perfect for every situation, but they're kind of like three different tools. Informative political discourse is particularly good when there have been recent changes in political development, or there are complex political issues, or there's a thing that you think that the other person doesn't know. And if approached in a respectful manner, can be pretty powerful, even can be persuasive. Now, persuasion is an important part of political discourse, and I don't want to demonize persuasion. Part of our society is about persuading each other, and the idea that has the most credulity, which is believed by the most number of people, chains out. And so sometimes you have a deeply held belief that something is right. You may really believe that those fetuses have souls and need not to be aborted. And you may really believe that commanding a woman what to do with their body is the most horrible foundation of society, and they need to have the right to have abortions, whatever. You may desperately believe your position, and you may want to persuade other people. This is particularly true around election time. You may honestly believe that this person is a better candidate than the other person. You may literally fear the hands of the country with one over the other. Persuasion is your key. It's also useful when you're doing more local organizing, when you are trying to address a political issue more directly. Persuasion is what's going to give you the social capital to be able to organize and to get your stuff done. Finally, invitational rhetoric. This is basically the most transformative of all of them, and probably is a great starting point in a lot of conversations. If you don't actually know the beliefs of the other person, or if you just know them in basic ways, and even if you know that you disagree with them, you might want to know more deeply why. Invitational rhetoric is also really awesome because it tends to make friends instead of enemies. Successful persuasion will make someone really often grateful. although sometimes they're upset even though they're persuaded. But oftentimes, failed persuasion, it makes enemies. But invitational rhetoric is a little bit safer, since the goal is mutual understanding, and you try to use respect. It's probably a better thing at the dinner table with your boyfriend's or girlfriend's parents than something like persuasion or information, because that might be seen as a little arrogant. So I want to wrap up with kind of a final thought. And that is a brief meditation on the notion of vulnerability. So, with all of this in mind, this is something that I do, and I do it explicitly, and it's worked pretty well for me. So, a political issue will come up in a conversation. And people will start kind of drawing the lines in the sand and saying, this is what I believe, this is what I believe, no, this is what I believe. And at some point early in the conversation, I simply say this. I say, are we trying to change each other's minds? Because if you're trying to change my mind, and you're not willing to change your mind, then I don't see as how this is going to be a productive conversation. And if I'm trying to change you, but I'm unwilling to change myself, then this isn't going to go well. So, there are really two postures that I would like to take on. Either, let's admit that neither of us are going to change, and this conversation can continue for the sake of information or invitation, better understanding. And let's just agree to that we're not entering this conversation because one of us is going to leave the victor, or the one who has changed the other but not changed themselves, the one who's moved someone toward them. If you're not willing to change and I'm not willing to change, let's just admit that, and let's talk for the sake of understanding, because I'm really curious as to what you have to say. Or, if you are willing to change, and I am willing to change, then let's foster that vulnerability. Let's be mutually vulnerable to change. And if this is about real transformation, if I really desperately desire you to think differently about this, then I had better foster intentionally my willingness to change on this issue. And so those are kind of the options. Either we try to represent these ideas because we admit that neither of us are changing, or we adopt a stance of mutual vulnerability, where both of us are willing to listen to what the other person has to say in earnest, with the possibility that we will indeed leave this conversation with our minds changed. Now, most people are a little weirded out by that. Because a lot of times we're so issue-based, kind of jumping up one meta level and addressing the conversation itself, not everybody's okay with. But generally people, although they might be slightly taken aback at first, eventually kind of work around to that being a really reasonable request, that we identify why we're having the conversation. And it's amazing. You'd think that people would always choose the first. They'd be like, no, I'm not going to change my mind. But fascinatingly enough, oftentimes people choose the second. And they say, no, I really am willing to hear you out, if you're willing to hear me out. And what I find is often the case is that we persuade each other in little ways. And that at the end of these sweeping conversations that have touched all of these different issues, that one of the people says, look, this is the one thing that I really want you to take away from this. And then the other person nods and says, wow, you know what? I get that. I get that. And you're probably right. And I want this to be the one thing that you take away. We are ultimately all teachers and learners at the same time. And there's a great temptation in politics to always teach and to never learn. But if this democratic experiment is going to move forward, we do need to change. Not all the time. Sometimes we just need information. And sometimes understanding is what we need. But mutual vulnerability, to find, even in our enemy, the best ideas, that's ideal communication. Mutual vulnerability. Anyway, that's what I have for today. This has been how to engage in political communication on an interpersonal level. Here are a handful of tips, and hopefully you can take them forward and make a more productive democratic society.